To quote Thomas Jefferson about Astor, your name will be handed down with that of Columbus and Raleigh as the father of the establishment and the founder of such an empire. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you guys so much for having me here. I'm really excited to talk about the story of Astoria. Try saying that 3 times fast. My name is Brandan Adams, and I'm the education manager here at the Mariners Museum and Park. We're going to talk about Astoria, and I found this book that I'm going to talk about very fascinating, kind of the reason behind why I want to talk about this story. I want to thank Curatorial for allowing me to present on this topic. And to give you all kind of a brief synopsis, we're going to be looking at a story of adventure, exploration, chaos, and survival. All of that encompassed in about an hour. Astoria was the first American colony on the west coast of North America, similar to Jamestown on the east coast. In reading quotes that the author has provided, he does use the term Indian. When I'm discussing the different groups, I'm going to say indigenous people or the tribe if that's available. I'll also do my best to pronounce all of the names in the presentation as best as possible. But without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. So this is the book that I read back in the summer of 2024. I just read it for fun and really enjoyed it. I highly recommend if you're able to read this story. It's really good. Peter Stark does a fantastic job of weaving together the two parties that we're going to talk about, one coming across the ocean and then one coming across land. He does a great job of weaving those stories together. So I just read it for fun. And then I was approached by Curatorial, I think last spring or summer, that says, hey, we're going to do, for lifelong learning, we're going to look at the topic of exploration. Would you like to present? And I immediately thought of this book because it was really good. It has a lot of things that they talk about in terms of exploration. So I reread the book in the summer of 25, and a lot of the research that you're going to see up here has to do with what Peter Stark had put in his book, along with actual documents that kind of came from that time. So to start our story, it starts with this man. This man is John Jacob Astor, the original John Jacob Astor, the first. He was the youngest of 4 brothers and grew up in Waldorf, Germany. As a boy, he worked as a butcher's assistant for his father. At age 16, he became a deckhand on a lumber boat, then spent several years in England living with his older brother. As Astor planned carefully for his future, he wanted to earn enough money to cross the Atlantic, learn English, and wait for the American Revolutionary War to end before moving to the United States. While crossing the Atlantic, Astor met a fellow German passenger who introduced him to the idea of the fur trade, which would change his life. He arrived in the U.S. in March of 1784 and made his way to New York City. In the mid-1780s, Astor sold fine musical instruments and wild animal pelts. He built business connections with British and French fur traders and traveled through upstate New York, where he spoke directly with the indigenous peoples involved in the fur trade. He later traveled to Montreal, where he learned more about the geography of North America and the abundance of furs in the continent's interior. By his mid-40s, Astor had become highly ambitious. In 1808, he wrote a letter to President Thomas Jefferson proposing the creation of a fur trade post on the Pacific coast. That summer, Astor met Jefferson in Washington, D.C. to discuss the plan. In 1810, Astor put his vision into action by sending 2 expeditions, one by land and one by sea, to meet at the Columbia River and begin building a fur trading post. His goal was to create a powerful Western emporium, which led to the founding of Astoria, the first permanent U.S. settlement on the Pacific coast. So Thomas Jefferson is involved as well. As president from 1801 to 1809, Thomas Jefferson strongly believed the U.S. should expand westward to the Pacific Ocean, viewing his expansion as essential for trade with Asia and for strengthening American territorial claims against Britain and Spain. His most important contribution to this goal was the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. which doubled the size of the nation, gave the U.S. control of land stretching towards the Pacific Northwest, and made American settlement and trade west of the Mississippi River realistic. Jefferson also personally commissioned and planned the Lewis and Clark expedition, instructing the explorers to map routes to the Pacific, establish relations with the Native Americans, evaluate commercial opportunities, especially the fur trade, and assert an American presence at the mouth of the Columbia River. The expedition's success provided detailed maps, valuable knowledge of the region, and proof that a transcontinental America was possible. Together, these two men joined forces to see Astor's ambitious plans become reality. Astor fully supported the founding of the Emporium financially and gave it economic and strategic purpose. He provided all of the funding along with the planning and the fur trade vision that drove the project. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, created the political, territorial, and strategic foundation that made Astoria possible. Through westward expansion policies, exploration, and the strengthening of the American claims in the Pacific Northwest, Jefferson enabled the conditions under which Astor's commercial vision could succeed. While Astor carried out the actual founding, Jefferson was the intellectual and political force that made it feasible. To quote Thomas Jefferson about Astor, Jefferson stated, "Your name will be handed down with that of Columbus and Raleigh as the father of the establishment and the founder of such an empire." Huge words from Thomas Jefferson. So why are we looking at the Pacific Northwest? In the early 19th century, the mouth of the Columbia River held significant strategic and economic value. It provided direct access to the interior of North America, and at a time when rivers functioned as the primary transportation networks prior to the development of railroads. The site was well suited for maritime trade, as seagoing vessels could dock and transfer goods efficiently. In addition, the surrounding area contained abundant populations of fur-bearing animals, particularly beavers, whose pelts were highly prized in international markets. It was Astor's vision that the Emporium would serve as a critical gateway within the fur trade system, enabling overseas ships to arrive, goods to be transported inland via the rivers, and valuable furs to be exported to global markets. So why choose the Pacific Northwest? Because of the furs. So sea otter and beaver furs were extremely valuable in the early 1800s because they were highly prized for the fashion that they had. Fur was one of the best natural resources for making durable and luxury goods, and demand for it was steady in both the United States and in overseas markets. Beaver furs were especially prized in the US and Europe due to the popularity of beaver felt hats. Before Europeans arrived, there were an estimated 60 to 400 million beavers in North America. Beaver fur has tiny barbs that allow it to be easily felted into dense, waterproof material, making it ideal for top hats. These hats were a symbol of wealth and social status, so demand remained high. Because North America had large beaver populations, the beaver fur trade became a major driver of American exploration, settlement, and economic growth. Sea otter furs were even more valuable in international trade, particularly in Asia. Nearly 1 million fine hairs per square inch, sea otters have the densest fur of any mammal, making their pelts extremely soft, warm, and luxurious. The fineness and denseness of the hairs thrive in frigid coastal waters all along the Pacific Northwest. Sea otters have no insulating blubber layers and rely on the double coat of fur for warmth. Outer guard hairs protect the soft, dense inner hairs, which trap air bubbles and serve as an insulating layer that keeps the otter's actual skin dry. Chinese markets, especially in Canton, paid very high prices for sea otter pelts. American traders used these furs to trade for such items as tea, silk, and porcelain, creating profitable Pacific trade routes. The Russian fur traders, who had begun to work for the Alaskan coast, had come to call the sea otter furs soft gold for the incredible prices they bought to the Chinese market. So this is the grand plan. I have a very, very large quote that I'm going to read to you that comes from Peter Stark, but he does a fascinating job of outlining what Astor envisioned and what he was going to do. So over these two maps, to quote, the two advancing parties, the seagoing and the overland, would meet at the mouth of the Columbia River. There, overlooking the Pacific, they would construct the first American colony on the West Coast. This great trading emporium would gather furs from the western half of North American continent. It would form the apex of an elegant and fantastically profitable triangle trade between three continents that employed a fleet of Astor ships continuously circling the globe. From manufactories in London and New York, the ships would carry inexpensive trade goods valued by the Indian, knives, blankets, pots, beads, around Cape Horn to the northwest coast. Here, along 2,000 miles of the forested, indented Pacific coastline, Astor's agents would exchange the trade goods with coastal Indians for valuable furs such as sea otter. They would also load the ships with fur funneled into the emporium from Astor's interior network of trading posts, which covered tens of thousands of square miles, as well as gather furs from Russian posts on the Alaskan coast. All right. To continue. When Astor ships would transport the heavy fur packets, sea otter, beaver, lynx, bear, across the Pacific, the captains would then sell the tremendous markup in China, where a powerful demand existed from wealthy Chinese. Then in China, Astor ships would load porcelain, silk, tea, and yellow Nanking cloth, which is yellow cotton, and sell those cargoes around the other half of the globe, or returning via the same route depending on conditions, to the markets of London and New York, completing the circumnavigation and reaping another astronomical profit from fashionable and eager European and American consumers of Chinese luxury goods. In order to do this, Astor needed two main leaders for his ambitious dream to become a reality. He needed a leader for the seagoing party and a leader for the overland party. This is our person for the seagoing party. His name is Captain Jonathan Thorne. He was commissioned or commanded the ship, the Tonkin, and his crew of 23 men and investors. A former officer in the U.S. Navy, Thorne had prior experience in naval warfare during the early 19th century. He was hired by Astor's Pacific Fur Company to captain the Tonkin on its voyage to the Pacific Northwest. Thorne was hired to sail the vessel around Cape Horn to the mouth of the Columbia River, where he played a key role in delivering the men, supplies, and equipment necessary for the establishment of Astoria. Despite his professional experience, Thorne was a highly controversial character. He was known for an extremely strict, arrogant, and inflexible leadership style, and his harsh discipline led to serious conflicts with both the crew and investors aboard the ship. Thorne frequently disregarded the advice of others, including warnings about hazardous navigation and the importance of respecting indigenous customs, decisions that would ultimately contribute to significant tension and risk during the expedition. For his route, he's going to start here in New York, go down and around South America. He does make a stop in the Falkland Islands. He also makes a stop in Hawaii before heading up to the Pacific and reaching the Columbia River. So that is the route that he was taking. Second person that we're going to talk about, the leader of the Overland Party, was Wilson Price Hunt. He was an American merchant and explorer for the Overland Expedition. Born in 1769 in New Jersey, Hunt was a successful businessman rather than an experienced frontiersman. Astor selected him not for his wilderness skills, but because he was trustworthy, educated, and loyal, qualities Astor valued in a chief agent responsible for advancing American commercial interest for his emporium. Appointed as Astor's principal representative in the region, Hunt led the overland expedition from 1810 to 1812, which was intended to reinforce the seagoing party that arrived by ship. Hunt's leadership style was vastly different from that of Captain Thorne. He often sought the opinions of his men and favored careful reasoning and group consensus before making decisions. While this approach fostered cooperation, it also proved costly in situations that required quick, decisive action. One of Hunt's most consequential decisions was to avoid the route previously taken by Lewis and Clark, out of concern for potential conflict with the Blackfeet. This choice led to the expedition into largely uncharted territory across what is today, present-day, Wyoming, Idaho, and Utah, resulting in one of the most difficult and disastrous early transcontinental journeys. And we're going to discuss that. So here is a map showing, starting off at St. Louis. They were supposed to go up the Missouri River. Does it not highlight? From here? Oh, no, it doesn't. So, where my little green X is there, St. Louis, they're going to go up the Missouri River. If you notice, it keeps going up. That was the Lewis and Clark expedition. That is everything that they had mapped. We'll talk about it, but Hunt was warned that the Blackfeet could be could have conflict with the Europeans. So they're going to actually cut across where it shows the unmapped terrain. Oh, is this? Oh, thank you. Look at that. Thank you so much. So this right here is showing the original Lewis and Clark's expedition, so going from the Missouri River and then being able to get to Astoria right here where the Columbia River is. For Hunt and his party, they're going to make their way up the Missouri River, but then they're going to stop here, and instead of continuing, they're going to go this way. So this had not been mapped by the Lewis and Clark expedition, so they don't actually know where they're going, and we're going to talk about why that's going to be an issue. So hopefully trying to find the Columbia River as best they can. All right, so we're going to look at the challenges between both the seagoing party, we'll start with the seagoing party, and then look at the overland party as well. Lots of different types of challenges. One being this guy. The fact that his last name is Thorne is really ironic because he was a pain in the butt, to put it nicely. He was just not a good character, and I'm going to read you some examples of what he did. So definitely harsh leadership and internal conflict with Captain Thor. He was widely known for his rigid discipline and harsh treatment of crew members and the investors. His authoritarian leadership style forced low morale, resentment, and poor cooperation, complicating an already difficult effort to establish a permanent settlement in the Pacific Northwest. Numerous instances illustrate Thorne's severity and lack of judgment. On one occasion, he left crew members ashore at the Falkland Islands after becoming embarrassed when he attempted to hunt a goose, but failed because the bird was unknowingly tethered to a rock. The crewmen laughed, like you all are doing, found it very funny. His ego was hurt, and so he left them on his ship out in the Falkland Islands. They tried to row on the Tulkin in a small little boat, but only after a crewman named Robert Stewart intervened did the ship turn back to retrieve them. While they were in Hawaii, several sailors deserted the vessel, because of what I've been talking about, prompting Thorne to respond with verbal abuse and extreme punishment. Once caught, one deserter was confined below decks, another was tied and flogged, and a third was placed in irons. In one of the most severe instances, a sailor named Edward Imes was brutally beaten with stalks of sugarcane and then thrown overboard on Thorne's orders. Imes survived only because he was rescued by a native Hawaiian. Collectively, these episodes show or demonstrate how Thorne's inflexible and abusive command undermined discipline, damaged trust, and heightened tensions during the exploration. These are three that I put in the presentation. Throughout the book, several of just the way that he treated the investors and his crewmen. There was a reason why people did not want to go and get back on board when they were in Hawaii also, or they didn't want to go back on board. So he was just a really not nice guy. All right, so we have that. We also have isolation and supply problems. So a second challenge was isolation and supply problems. This was among the most serious challenge faced by the settlers at Astoria. Supplies were limited and resupply by sea was slow, uncertain, and dangerous, forcing the settlers to become self-sufficient in an unfamiliar and often hostile environment. These difficulties were evident even before the expedition reached the Pacific Northwest. After the Tolkien set sail on September 8th of 1810, fresh water quickly became scarce. By November 20th, water rations were reduced to 1.5 pints a day, and by December 2nd to just 1 pint per person. This shortage was made worse by a diet heavily dependent on salted meat, which increased thirst and dehydration. The crew's situation did improve temporarily when they reached the Falkland Islands on December 5th and were able to go ashore and find fresh food and fresh water. Third challenge here is the navigation of the Columbia River. I did want to ask, has anybody ever actually been to Astoria and parts of Oregon? Okay, that is one place I have not been. But when I was doing my research, I found it fascinating about all this information on the Columbia River. So the Columbia River located at the Columbia River Bar, located at the mouth where the Pacific Ocean meets the river. It is and remains one of the most hazardous river entrances in the world, earning its nickname the Graveyard of the Pacific. Here on the East Coast, we have the Graveyard of the Atlantic that goes up and down the East Coast. This is just talking about getting in and out of the river, from the Columbia River into the Pacific Ocean. We're going to touch more on this when we go back to talking about how the Tolkien and Captain Thorne was actually able to land, but we will return to this in just a moment. So relations with the indigenous peoples. The fourth challenge was the different relationships that they had. So a success of Astoria depended heavily on trade with local tribes, especially the Chinook. But cultural misunderstandings, language barriers, and mutual suspicion made these relationships fragile. Captain Thorne's action directly contradicted the instructions he had received from Astor, who had urged caution and diplomacy in dealing with native peoples. Astor emphasized showing kindness whenever possible and exercising restraint when tensions arose, warning that past disasters along the coast had often resulted from trusting too easily in the apparent friendliness of indigenous groups. Astor wrote these instructions to Thorne, quote, "If you find them kind, as I hope you will, be so to them. If otherwise, act with caution and forbearance, and convince them that you come as friends. Be particularly careful on the coast, and not rely too much on the friendly disposition of the natives. All accidents which have as yet happened there arose from too much confidence in the Indians." So Thorne's failure to follow the guidance proved disastrous for the expedition, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Environmental challenges were also an issue, especially in the Pacific Northwest. The region's climate was marked by persistent rain, cold temperatures, damp conditions that soaked clothing, tools, supplies, and made life very uncomfortable and labor exhausting. Dense rainforests with massive trees and thick undergrowth made land clearing extremely slow, with muddy, uneven terrain hindering transportation and the movement of heavy material needed for construction. These conditions greatly delayed the building of shelters and defense structures. In addition, the cold and wet environment made food preservation very difficult. The resulting dependence on salted food and the lack of fresh fruits and vegetables increased the risk of nutritional deficiencies, particularly scurvy, which weakened settlers and reduced their ability to work. Final thing we're going to talk about is foreign competition. So particularly from the British fur traders, they posed a major challenge to the success of Astoria. Long before the Americans arrived, the Northwest Company, a powerful British-Canadian fur trading firm, was already deeply established throughout the Pacific Northwest. Its traders had extensive experience in the region, well-developed trade networks with indigenous nations, and reliable supply lines stretching from Canada to the interior. In contrast, Astoria was isolated, undersupplied, and dependent on uncertain sea routes. British traders could undercut American prices, divert indigenous trade away from Astoria, and threaten seizure of the post with the backing of British naval power. This combination of economic strength and political influence placed Astoria at a severe disadvantage, underscoring how foreign competition undermined Astor's vision of an American-dominated fur trade in the Pacific Northwest. Do we have a question?
We do.
Okay, great.
I was wondering if Stark had made any reference to the California missions that were in place 50 years or so ahead of Astoria and would have been a source of fruit and other resources. So just curious.
Mm-hmm. So what I've read from Peter Stark's book, he does not mention California or anything that was going on for that. Not to say that in his research it didn't come about, but the book does not touch on that. It's a good question. All right. So we've looked at the seagoing challenges. Now we're going to look at the overland party challenges. Pretty much the same of what they all faced, just this time on land. So first looking at isolation and remote and rugged landscape. Astoria's extreme geographic isolation for the rest of the United States created serious challenges for those attempting to establish and maintain the settlement. Astoria was separated from the nation's population centers by thousands of miles of wilderness, including mountains, rivers, and other hostile terrain. There was no reliable or rapid system of communication, meaning that messages sent east could take many months, sometimes years, to receive a response. Likewise, reinforcements, supplies, or instructions from the trading partners could not arrive quickly, if at all. As a result, the settlers were forced to rely almost entirely on their own judgment and resources. Any miscalculation, whether related to diplomacy with the Native Americans, competition with foreign power, or survival logistics, carried potentially disastrous consequences, making every decision a matter of high risk and long-term significance. This is a picture in our collection, and I was glad I was able to find something pertaining to this. So this picture is showing portage, Portage, there we go, portage. Portage is the carrying of boats and goods, supplies, overland from one entrance into a navigable waterway to another. The overland party, they did go on rivers, the Missouri River, they started out, but with the large party that they had, roughly 60 people, anytime they had to reroute or go around something, they're having to take the canoes, take them out, go to the next place of where they're going to put in, take all the supplies, take all the people, and then get back in and continue going upriver. That takes a whole lot of time, a whole lot of effort, and as you see with the issues of supply problems, a lot of energy is exerted to do that, and by the time we get to when they're kind of in trouble, they don't have a whole lot of supplies. So having to do portage in and out of the different rivers made it extremely difficult, and this has to do with the landscape as well. They're going up and down rivers, hills, different type of terrain. So our supply problems. So the second big issue, oh, yes. There is a question, right?
Curious, you said the overland didn't really know where they were going. So how did they know they were going from river to river?
Because they had the Native Americans to help them. When we'll talk about their relationship with the indigenous peoples. The seagoing party didn't do as well with the relationship between the indigenous people, but the overland party with Hunt, because of his character and he was a lot better at negotiating, he's going to get a lot of assistance from the indigenous folks, the Shoshone, the Cheyenne, that's out there, and we're going to touch on that. I think we got a question over here too. Yeah, no, you're good.
Well, just going on what the other gentleman just said too, it looked like they cut over land way south of where they kind of running up. Did they have any wagons? I mean, how'd they get over land? It seemed like it was mostly land-centric, and to see them portaging canoes from one, I don't understand how it all worked out.
So they hired folks in Canada, voyageurs that they call them, that used birch bark canoes that were cut down, made into canoes, and then going upriver. Once they decided to cut through land, it was all on walking and horses. So that's what they used. They didn't have any wagons, which, when we talk about it, made the whole issue of I can continue up the river and it's going to be a lot smoother, but the Blackfeet, and we'll talk about why the Blackfeet were so hostile towards Europeans, Hunt didn't want to take that chance. So that's why they ended up going overland. But no wagons are mentioned in Stark's book, so it's all walking and horses.
Who took longer, the seafaring party or the one that went cross country? And how long did it take to get around the Horn?
Yeah, so for the seagoing party, I believe it took 7, 8 months, close to a year. The overland party is going to take 18 months. It's going to take much longer. And we'll talk about that as well. All right. You guys got good questions, so we're good. All right. So our supply problem. Here's just a few examples of the supply problems that were faced by Hunt's party. They faced severe nutritional challenges that significantly undermined their ability to continue the journey. Available food supplies were insufficient to meet the basic caloric requirements, as lean meat such as bison, elk, and deer provided only approximately 600 to 800 calories per pound. As a result, each individual would have needed to consume between 3 and 5 pounds of meat per day merely to sustain their energy that they were exerting going across land. The party often ran out of food, and as caloric deficits persisted, Ramsey Crooks, who was a partner of the Overland Party, experienced catabolism, which is a physiological process in which the body breaks down its own fat and muscle tissue to sustain essential organ function. Compounding these difficulties, the party also suffered from scurvy, one of the most significant medical obstacles faced by early explorers. Typically developed between 10 and 12 weeks without access to fresh foods, scurvy initially causes fatigue, weakness, and later progressions of swollen gums, loosening of the teeth, and the reopening of old wounds as collagen tissue deteriorates. In advanced stages, the disease led to internal hemorrhaging, organ failure, and ultimately death. In addition, at one point of their journey, one of the cottonwood canoes that the party was traveling on slams into a very massive boulder, splitting the hull and spilling out all of the food and gear, which was swept downriver. So losing all of these supplies and running out of the supplies were constant problems for the overland trail. So here is a map showing, again, where they're going to start off at down here in St. Louis. This now shows the route that they decide to take. So yes, somebody had pointed out saying way south of where the Blackfeet territory was. So this is Blackfeet. Coming down here, way south, they're going to get help from the Shoshone, the Cheyenne as well, making their way here. And then ultimately, they do find the Mad River, which is a kind of connection to the Columbia River, and they are able to make it to Astoria. But all of this was unknown territory, so they didn't always know where they were going and had to rely on the indigenous people to help them for that. Oh, we have a question. Okay, great.
Any people on the were there any people on the expedition who'd been on the Lewis and Clark expedition previously?
There weren't. We're going to talk about one woman. She was a Native American. The research shows that she probably knew Sacagawea to help with that, but nobody that from what I've read, from the Lewis and Clark expedition were a part of the Hunt expedition. But that is a great question. That may have been helpful, possibly. We're going to talk about why they didn't like why the Blackfeet didn't like them. To sum up this, the parties were able to find the Columbia River, but it took time and effort since they were going through unmapped territory. Hunt also split his party into smaller groups and separated due to the growing food shortage. For him, it was easier to feed roughly 15 or 20 people versus 60 or more. And that's how many started with the expedition of roughly 60. We'll talk about how many end up making it. All right, international competition as well. So this was also from the seagoing party. But they also faced international competition. Astoria faced constant pressure from the more established British traders of the Northwest Company, who already dominated trade networks and relationships with the local indigenous tribes. Northwest Company was a major Canadian fur trading founded in Montreal. It was created by the Scottish and French-Canadian merchants who competed with the Hudson Bay Company for control of the North American fur trade. By the early 1800s, the Northwest Company had expanded far west into the Great Lakes region, the Canadian prairies, and the Pacific Northwest, making it a powerful presence in areas where Astor was trying to establish his emporium. So this right here is a brief overview of what the two parties faced. A lot of it was the same issues going on, just one on the ocean and one overland. But I do want to read a good synopsis that Peter Stark says. The journeys of the seagoing and overland parties sent to establish Astoria differed dramatically in scope, difficulty, and risk. The seagoing party, led by Thorne, traveled by ship around Cape Horn, completing a long but relatively continuous voyage. Their primary dangers were storms, shipwreck, and navigational hazards, most notably at the Columbia River Bar. But once they arrived, their journey was largely complete. They began with well-stocked provisions aboard the ship and anticipated future resupply by sea. Environmental hardships were primarily coastal, including rain, cold, and damp conditions. Interactions with the indigenous peoples was mostly limited to trade near the Columbia River, and conflicts were generally sudden and situational. Leadership followed a strict naval hierarchy under Thorne, which caused tensions but rarely threatened immediate survival. The seagoing party arrived in relatively good health and well-equipped, allowing them to begin construction of the emporium properly. I put relatively good health because, in contrast, when you look at the overland party led by Hunt, they faced a far more grueling journey across the 1,000 miles of landscape, traveling on foot, by river, and on horseback. Their challenges were constant, encompassing extreme environmental conditions, including the heat of the Great Plains, snow in the Rocky Mountains, and water shortages. Supplies were often lost or depleted early, forcing the party to rely heavily on hunting, trading, or indigenous assistance. Starvation was a persistent threat, sometimes requiring the consumption of horses, dogs, or roots to survive. Leadership decisions, particularly regarding trade selections, were often matters of life and death, and the party frequently fractured into smaller groups, weakening coordination and safety. As a result, the overland expedition arrived months later than the seagoing party, physically exhausted, malnourished, and in poor condition, limiting their immediate contribution to the settlement and increasing their dependence on those already established at Astoria. All right, so we're going to now talk about how do they actually get into the Columbia River, or at least the seagoing party. How are they able to do that? So a little bit of background on the Columbia River and why it's dangerous even today. The mouth of the Columbia River, known as the Columbia River Bar, or the Graveyard of the Pacific, is one of the world's most dangerous navigational hazards. As the river flows into the Pacific Ocean at an average of 265,000 cubic feet per second, its powerful currents collide with incoming ocean waves, creating steep, unstable, and unpredictable seas. Large amounts of sediment carried downstream form constantly shifting sandbars that make the water shallow and alter navigational channels, often causing waves to break suddenly. These hazards are further intensified by severe Pacific weather, such as storms, strong winds, fog, and heavy seas, and by tidal forces that clash with the river's outflow, especially during incoming tides. As a result of these combined dangers, hundreds of ships have wrecked in this area since the early 19th century. And I've already showed you this map, but every red dot that you see there are different shipwrecks, the ones that have been found. Oh. Miss Wisteria's coming.
In that area, were the tides very extreme?
Yes, so that was part of it too. When the tides are coming in and out, that's going to be an issue for getting the ships or boats into the river.
Okay. Do you know how far up the river that and I can't remember the term, where the constant flow out of the river and the tidal part, I just can't remember the term.
I know what you're talking about. I don't know what that's called, but I know for...
May have been pretty far upriver.
Yeah, when we talk about where Astoria lands, it's actually 11 miles upriver, so it's not right at the mouth where you're seeing it here. They do have to go further up the river to find a safe place to land, to dock. All right, so we're going to talk about how Thorn is able to land in the Columbia River. It takes several attempts. The first attempt to navigate into the Columbia River involved a man named Mr. Fox. He was a crewman, 3 voyagers, and an experienced older sailor. The river's waters proved so turbulent that the boat was quickly lost, and Thorn made no attempt to rescue the men that had went out there. Some people's, or what Peter Starks had said, is that he was trying to get rid of the older sailor, and so that's the reason that he said, you are going to try first, and they were not rescued, and they were ultimately lost out to sea. Subsequently, Thorn dispatched a Scotsman, 2 crew members, and 2 Hawaiians to measure the water's depth using a lead-weighted line. This party successfully identified a navigable channel that allowed Thor to guide the Tolkien into the river. However, he refused to retrieve the men, declaring, quote, "I will not endanger the ship." The expedition across the Columbia Bar was harrowing, the crew enduring violent surf, and one of the Hawaiians succumbed to hypothermia. It ultimately required 3 separate attempts before a safe passage into the river could be secured. Despite these efforts, the Tonkin was able to anchor in Baker's Bay, though the operation proved fatal for several crew members, with a total of 8 men losing their lives while just trying to attempt to get into the Columbia River. So I've already showed you this map, or one similar to it. Here, the Pacific Ocean, waves crashing in this way, the Columbia River, the outflow here. This right here is what they call the Columbia Bar. These are all different like sand, different sediments being tossed back and forth. So getting into the channel was very difficult. When they are able, they're going to land here in Baker's Bay, and then ultimately Astoria is going to be founded right here. So do go up the river. All right, so establishing the fort. The the seagoing party are the first ones to arrive for the 2 parties. The crew of the Tolkien explored upriver and sailed approximately 11 miles to identify a suitable location for the new trading post. They founded the fort on April 12th of 1811, and once the site was chosen, the men began clearing land and building a warehouse to protect the trade goods, ultimately naming the settlement Astoria after John Jacob Astor. Progress was slow and arduous. It took nearly 2 days to cut down a single tree, and after almost 2 months, scarcely an acre of land had been cleared. Hunt's Overland Party, led by, so they had split the parties. This party was led by a person named Donald Mackenzie. He was a partner of the Overland Party. Him and his party finally reached Astoria on January 18th of 1812. And about a month later, on February 15th, 1812, Hunt and the rest of his party were able to join the settlement. So several months after, so from April to January, that's how much time was in between. So relations with the Native Americans or the indigenous people for both the seagoing and the overland parties, both parties relied heavily on it. And when we talk about exploration, from my own thesis or my own judgment here, I would say that it was really the indigenous tribes that helped them to explore these places. Otherwise, I think everyone would have probably not survived. So they really did do a great job or working with the Native Americans, at least the Overland Party did. We're going to talk about the Seagoing Party first. So since the Seagoing Party and Overland parties relied heavily on them for everything, relied heavily on the indigenous people for everything, food, navigation, trade, everything. Here are a few examples of interactions with the indigenous peoples for the Seagoing Party. Once a place was chosen to build a new emporium, Captain Thorne sailed the Tulkun north towards Vancouver with the goal of trading with indigenous peoples in the region and acquiring valuable furs for the Pacific Fur Company. While en route to Vancouver, Thorne took on an interpreter, an indigenous interpreter named Josiah. Josiah warned the captain that local tribes would be treacherous and that many still harbored resentment towards an earlier American trading vessel whose crew had mistreated them. Despite the caution, Thorne continued his mission. During one trading encounter, an elder chief named Newport came aboard the Tonkin to negotiate the sale of sea otter furs. Thorne attempted to bargain, but the chief believed the offered price was unfair. The situation escalated when Thorne insulted Newport by grabbing a fur and rubbing it in the chief's face. Both McKay and Ross, who were crewmen for the Tonkin, warned Thorne that such behavior would provoke retaliation, but Thorne dismissed their concerns. Soon after, members of the Clayoquot tribe came aboard the Tonkin to trade furs for blankets and metal goods such as pots. As more Clayoquots climbed onto the ship, Thorne remained unconcerned, although McKay and Josiah grew increasingly uneasy. Unbeknownst to the crew, the Clayoquots were planning to coordinate a surprise attack using pagamogans, deadly clubs made of whalebone or stone shaped with knobs or spikes at the end. The attack was swift and brutal. Captain Thorne and 2 crew members were killed during the initial assault. Before dying, Thorne ordered 7 sailors to set sail, but after the 3 men were killed, the remaining crew barricaded themselves below deck. McKay was captured and killed in a particularly violent manner with his head hanging over the side of the canoe and attackers battering him with the pagamogans. The 5 or 6 men still alive on board the Tonkin faced limited options to escape. They could either attempt to sail out of the cove or row away in a longboat. 4 of the men chose to flee by longboat, while 1 man remained aboard the ship. The following day, Josiah, the interpreter, observed from ashore as an estimated 400 to 500 of the native people boarded the Tonkin to loot it. Suddenly, a massive explosion tore through the vessel when the lone crewman ignited approximately 9,000 pounds of gunpowder, destroying the ship and killing everyone aboard. The 4 men who had attempted to escape were later recaptured and slowly tortured to death, this bringing an end to the Tonkin and the tragic end to the Tonkin. So that was Thorne and his relationship with the indigenous people. I kind of think he kind of got what he deserved. He was just not a good guy. All right. It was a little bit different, significantly different with the Overland Party. Hunt knew what he was doing for the most part. So Hunt and his party relied heavily on assistance from various indigenous tribes as they traversed the interior of the continent towards the Columbia River. Hunt was also had much better relations with the indigenous tribes as he came in contact with them than Thorne. From the beginning of the journey, the expedition included a woman named Marie Dorian. She was a Native American translator who was 3 months pregnant at the time and traveling with her 2 sons. She's the one who did speak to Sacagawea, so there was that little bit of relationship, but that was really the only part that Peter Stark talks about in his book of the relationship between the Lewis and Clark expedition and the Hunt party. So Dorian played a crucial role in facilitating communication between Hunt's party and the indigenous tribes they encountered. The expedition received significant help from the Cheyenne, who assisted them in crossing the Bighorn Mountains and continuing towards the Tetons. At the base of these mountains, the party identified a westward flowing river that led towards the Pacific Ocean. which they recognized as part of the Columbia River system. Communication with the Shoshone, however, was a little more difficult. Language barriers hindered the party's ability to determine the river's precise location. With the Shoshone, however, proved, oh my Lord, hang on just a second, guys. Wow, communication with the Shoshone proved far more difficult. Language barriers hindered the party's ability to determine the river's precise location, leading Hunt to pressure 3 Shoshone men into guiding the expedition back towards a smaller group of men who had been left behind. In a controversial decision, Hunt concluded that the success of the enterprise outweighed the welfare of the most physically weakened individuals. By this stage, the party had been reduced to 32 white men, the woman, Marie Dorian, now 8 months pregnant, and her 2 young sons. They now also had 3 native guides to help them. The Shoshone successfully led the group to camp where the expedition rested and recovered for several days. From there, the Columbia River lay only 2 days' travel away, providing a final and relatively accessible route towards their destination. Countless times, Hunt and his party traded/negotiated buying horses from the indigenous tribes to help feed his party. Horses and sometimes dogs as well to help feed his party. All right, so there's a thing called the War of 1812. That's going to happen. That's going to interrupt Astor's plans to build this emporium. Unfortunately. So the War of 1812 had a major and ultimately damaging effect on Astoria, transforming what was intended to be a permanent American trading post into a short-lived outpost. When war broke out between the U.S. and Great Britain, Astoria became isolated and vulnerable, cut off from American resupply and military support while lying thousands of miles from the East Coast. In contrast, British forces in Canada and British fur traders were much closer and better positioned to exert influence. The powerful Northwest Company took advantage of the situation, threatening to seize Astoria by force. Fearing they could not defend the post, the Americans opted to sell Astoria to the Northwest Company in 1813, after which a British naval ship formally took control and renamed the settlement Fort George. The war effectively destroyed Astor's vision of a global fur trading empire based out of Astoria, as both the overland and the Pacific trade routes were disrupted. Although the settlement eventually returned to U.S. control by a treaty, Britain continued to dominate the regional fur trade for decades. So abandoning Astoria. With the War of 1812, the leaders of Astoria debated back and forth of should we abandon the settlement or not. Donald McKenzie, who I've talked about a little bit, he's the partner of the Overland Party, argued that Astor favored American interest over British ones and recommended that the post be evacuated. Duncan McDougall, who was a partner for the seagoing party, however, hoped to form an alliance by marrying Chief Comcomly's daughter. So Chief Comcomly was the native of the Chinooks, or the chief of the Chinooks. He had a daughter. They married. This believed that it would help protect Astoria. McDougall believed his marriage could help better protect the fort by having this alliance with the local tribe. Despite this, a gentleman named John George McTavish, he was an official with the Northwest Company, representing British interests, pressured McDougall to sell, warning that British would seize the post by force if he refused. On October 23rd, 1813, McDougall accepted the offer, selling the furs that had already been collected at roughly 30 cents on the dollar. Astor later estimated that this amounted to approximately $40,000, of which should have been closer to $200,000 worth of goods, making a significant financial loss and the effective end of the American outpost. All right, so why didn't Astoria succeed? There were a lot of reasons, but mainly a lot of psychological issues with the men, including isolation, fear, and uncertainty. The settlement was extremely remote, with no other white U.S. settlers within 1,000 miles. There were white settlers in Canada, and they belonged to British, so with the War of 1812 looming, not a good sign for them. Endless mud and rain wore on the men's spirits, and their surroundings were a daily reminder of how rough and unfinished life in Astoria was. Being surrounded by bands of Native Americans whose intentions they did not fully understand added to their anxiety and sense of vulnerability. Fear increased when key members of the group left the fort. Duncan McDougall became increasingly paranoid after the ship Tonkin sailed north to Vancouver, and other men traveled up the Columbia River, leaving Astoria poorly defended. McDougall worried that Native groups might attack the settlement or steal their goods, which heightened tensions and distrust within the fort. This constant fear of attack and loss made it difficult for the men to feel safe or confident about the future. Low morale caused some men to give up entirely, even after surviving the long and dangerous journey to Astoria. Ramsey Crooks and Robert McLean, both partners of the Overland Trail, or the Overland Party, and John Day, who was just a member of the Overland Party, decided to leave, showing how overwhelming the mental strain had become. The realization that success was uncertain and that survival itself was not guaranteed pushed some men beyond their emotional limits. The psychological toll was especially severe for John Day, who attempted suicide. His actions were likely caused by extreme trauma, what we now know as PTSD, combined with the terrifying thought of having to travel back east through the mountains and Indian Territory. His experience reflects how the hardships of exploration affected not just the body, but also the mind, leaving lasting emotional damage on many of the men involved in founding Astoria. So to kind of conclude, wrap it up, we are doing great on time. The founding of Astoria came at a heavy human and financial cost. A total of 61 men died during the establishment of the settlement in its early years. This equated to about 41% of the entire folks involved. Astor attributed the failure to his Pacific fur trading empire to the actions of his leaders. Astor said Thorne and Hunt struggled to maintain relations. So Thorne struggled to maintain positive relations with the indigenous people, while Hunt spent extended periods away from Astoria in Hawaii and the Marquesas. Once Hunt, who was part of the Overland Party, arrived in Astoria, he needed to get back to Astor to let him know that he had gotten there. This time he takes a ship, but that ship makes stops in Hawaii and Marquesas and stays there for quite a while before heading back to New York. However, Astor himself was not present to oversee the operations, providing only financial support from the East Coast. While his plans for Astoria were meticulous, they failed to account for many hazards of the Pacific Northwest, including brutal storms, hostile interactions with the Native Americans, extreme remoteness, slow communication, vulnerability to foreign powers, dense rainforests, and surf-battered coasts. These factors combined to make the settlement far more perilous and difficult than Astor had anticipated. All right, so we are going to look at some of the two parties, what they explored. Explored being a very loose term here. In terms of the places that they had gone, there had been other Europeans/Americans that had been there before. But just hearing about the stories of what they encountered, I thought it'd be cool to share. So the Seagoing Party undertook an extensive and ambitious voyage in preparation for establishing Astoria. On December 5th, they spotted the Falkland Islands, going ashore to obtain fresh water and food. The expedition then rounded Cape Horn and sailed towards Hawaii, covering approximately 15,000 miles over 5 months since departing New York. Following Astor's instructions, Thorne hired Hawaiians for their swimming skills and safety in the water. Upon landing on the Big Island, the crew visited the site where Captain Cook had landed and later met his demise 3 decades earlier. From there, they sailed on to Oahu, arriving at Waikiki Bay before continuing northward to the Columbia River, where the crew of the Tonkin explored upriver for a suitable site for the trade post. The expedition also touched the coast of Vancouver, British Columbia, as part of their survey of the Pacific Northwest. Robert Stewart, who was a partner of the Seagoing Party, explored the Willamette River to identify potential sites for fur posts, which were believed to be rich in beaver populations. For our Overland Party, or for our Overland expedition, they explored a little bit more, but again, very heavily reliant on the indigenous people. So confrontation with the choice of continuing along the Missouri River through Blackfeet territory or leaving the river and crossing the Rockies on foot, Hunt chose for the latter. With guidance from the Cheyenne, the party crossed the Bighorn Mountains and eventually reached the Tetons, where they discovered a westward flowing river leading to the Pacific Ocean. In mid-October, they arrived at the river, which they referred to as the Mad River, after crossing the Continental Divide. The expedition then navigated Hell's Canyon along the Snake River, North America's deepest gorge, measuring roughly 1.5 miles in depth. After 20 days attempting to find a viable route out of the Mad River, Hunt's party identified the best path across the final third of the continent. Explorers Robert Stewart and Ramsey Cooks traversed the rolling highlands of present-day southwestern Wyoming and crossed the Continental Divide as well as a point suitable for loading wagons, which later became a key section of the Oregon Trail. The Overland Party also found a river that they called the Spanish River. This was an accurate piece of geographic knowledge that the Shoshone hunters gave the Hunt Party. Hunt's Spanish River was what we call today the Green River, a main branch of the Colorado. It flows all the way from northwestern Wyoming and, after joining the Colorado and coursing through the Grand Canyon, enters the Gulf of California, where what then were Spanish missions in Sonora, Mexico, and Baja California. The Shoshone hunters 1,000 miles to the north knew this geography and knew of the far-off settlements in 1811, even though many of them had never seen a white man before, which I thought was pretty wild. To bring it back to John Jacob Astor, so his emporium on the West Coast didn't go as planned, but don't worry, he still does very well for himself. So even though his Astoria was unsuccessful, he was still able to build a massive fur empire east of the Rocky Mountains, dominating the fur trade from the Great Lakes to the Rockies, since Astoria was a bust. In the mid-1830s, he sold his fur business to Ramsey Crooks, the partner of the Overland Party, and retired from active trade. Oregon officially became part of the U.S. in 1846, and Astor dies 2 years later. At the time of his death, he was worth about $20 million, roughly equivalent to $110 billion today, making him one of the wealthiest Americans of all time. When you factor in inflation, he ranks among the top 4 richest Americans in history, alongside one being John D. Rockefeller with the oil company, Andrew Carnegie being second with the steel, Cornelius Vanderbilt being third with railroads. He was fourth, and then rounding out the top 5 is Stephen Girard for banking. So, to conclude this, because I wanted to put in a little bit of what we have here at the Mariners Museum. These are some ships, some small craft that we have in our international small craft section over in the museum there. The book does touch on bull boats, which is this that you see right here, and this right here is a birch bark canoe. These two are birch bark canoes. The book references bull boats. They were used to travel back and forth between rivers. According to information that we have in our catalog, this bull boat, which is one of only a few that we have that's actually a round shape, can hold between 800 and 1,000 pounds. And this little one, and if you haven't seen it before, I highly recommend going to check it out because it is relatively small, but it can hold a lot of weight just based on the structure of it. These two right here are birch bark canoes, and so when the indigenous people and the Canadian voyagers, when they were traveling and they needed to create some type of canoe, this is what they were using if they could find birch bark, and so I wanted to point those out as well. And with that, I am happy to answer any questions that you may have.